Very much. Well, there's quite a lot of touch points there, I think, between the two talks, but any similarity is purely coincidental. I just want to say that now. The blipper. Oh, yeah, thank you. Cheers. So, I'm Karen Sampson, and I head up Lloyds Banking Group Archives and Museum. And I've called this talk a responsible business, which is perhaps a little unusual given the sort of recent history of the financial institutions in the UK, including HBOS, which is part of Lloyds Banking Group. But basically, we're part of responsible business and inclusion in the bank. And so the responsible business area maintains the group's Helping Britain Prosper plan, which was drawn up several years ago as a way of helping the group to sort of focus on areas where it felt it could make the main greatest difference in the UK. And what we've spent a lot of our time doing in the archive is providing proof points that demonstrate how we've always helped Britain prosper. This isn't a new thing. This is something we've been doing for a very long time. We've got a number of main brands. Of our main brands, we've got the two, Bank of Scotland and Lloyds Bank, and they've been financing trade and industry for well over 300 years. But it's the good archives that I want to talk about today. So that's the Halifax, which was a building society founded in 1852, and then TSB, which is made up of hundreds of smaller savings banks, many of which were founded in the early part of the 19th century. Now, we did sell the TSB brand back in 1913, but it's still very much part of our DNA, and we've still got its archives, which we're keen for people to come in and use for research purposes. So let's start with the savings bank movement. Very nice picture there of Sheffield Savings Bank. I'm always amazed just quite how grand the savings banks were set up to help the poor to save, essentially, but their buildings are so fantastic and grand. It's quite incredible. So unlike Lloyds and Bank of Scotland, the early savings banks were set up as philanthropic concerns, and they were to, and I quote, to encourage habits of industry, economy and sobriety among the poor and labouring population, and they were run by trustees on a voluntary basis. They were the model was very different to how Lloyds and Bank of Scotland started. They usually only opened for a couple of hours a week. They didn't allow customers often to deposit more than £20 a year. They could fine depositors if they didn't deposit regularly, and often a depositor would be quizzed if they wanted to withdraw their money. Essentially, I think they were keen they didn't go off and squander it on drink and gambling. The archive itself is extensive, and I would say it's very underused as well, so we're trying to encourage people to come in and use the TSB archives. That's a picture of one there. It's sort of often overlooked by economic historians who come to visit us because obviously the savings banks didn't offer loans. But they do provide an invaluable insight into the savings habit of the labouring classes, and it also tells you a lot about the local areas in which these savings banks were founded as well. And unlike BOS and unlike Bank of Scotland and Lloyds, they had very, very many female and children who were savers as well. This is a particularly interesting minute book from York County Savings Bank, and I particularly just like the description it gives of the types of depositors they had. So it had servants, labourers, mechanics, journeymen, clerks, little tradesmen and very small farmers. And then at the bottom we've got imperfectly described and dubious. So that's a little insight into some of the savings bank material that we've got at Lloyds. So I'm going to move on to the Halifax Building Society. Sarah has very helpfully explained the origins of the Building Society movement and the principles behind it, so I won't have to do that. But so one of the Lloyds brands is Halifax, which is no longer a building society because it did demutualise. But Halifax, for those who don't know, is a town in the north of England that was transformed by the Industrial Revolution. Its wealth came from the cotton and wool trades, and it had very many sort of weaving mills there as well. The population had actually doubled between 1830 and 1850. Charles Dickens, the author, described it as the town as a dreadful place with damp and wretched dwellings. So this was basically the setting when the Halifax Building Society was established, as I said, in 1852. And it was, as Sarah has said as well, set up to help ordinary working people to save to buy their house. What I wanted to focus on was just a couple of aspects. Oh, I would add, again, referring to something Sarah said, everything does happen in the pub. The Halifax was founded in the Cock and Bottle pub. So, so the records that I want to focus on today are about the development, the role that the Halifax played in developing model villages and also social housing. So the Ackroyd family was a very well-known family in Halifax, and they were mill owners, and they wanted to improve living conditions for their workers in the mills. And one of the members of the family, Colonel Edward Ackroyd, he wanted to increase the quantity and the quality of the housing for his workers. So he created a garden suburb, which he modestly called Ackroydon. It was designed by Sir George Gilbert Scott, who's probably most famous for the Grand Midland Hotel at St Pancras Station in London, which is a magnificent building. This is not quite so grand. But in 1860, the Halifax advanced the money to buy the land on which this model village was built. And then the Halifax went on over the next few years to lend around about £15,000 to its members to buy the houses. So fast forward to the interwar. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot. I included a picture of St Pancras Hotel just in case you didn't know what it looked like. So fast forward into sort of the interwar years, and there was a critical housing shortage in the UK. And in 1933, the UK government passed the Housing Financial Provisions Act, which was aimed at providing enough houses for lower income families to rent at affordable prices. By this point, the Halifax was actually the largest building society in the world, and it did play a prominent role in financing the building of this social housing. So under the Act, building societies were encouraged to loan money to private builders at exceptionally low rates for exceptionally long periods of time. And these loans were guaranteed by central government and local authorities. So there were nearly 17,000 houses built during this period, and 60% of which were financed by the Halifax. These are two examples of the estates, examples of two estates that the Halifax financed. That's a little bit about the Halifax archive, but I wanted to end with some of my, purely really because they're my favourite bits of the archive, but it's some advertising material that we have from the good archives. It is one of the heavily used parts of our collection. And this is one of my favourites. This is from the Halifax. The Halifax and TSB started advertising an awful lot earlier than Bank of Scotland and Lloyds Bank, because they felt, the Lloyds and Bank of Scotland felt that it just wasn't proper for banks to advertise, because it was seen as you got recommended to be a customer, so you were lucky to be a customer. But the Halifax and TSB advertised a lot earlier. This is a great one. It's known as the Misery Advert. And if you look carefully at the symbolism, you've got the poor, destitute guy on the left, and in the background you can see the pub, and then the very successful guy on the right. You can see in the background there's a church, so there's a little bit of symbolism going on there. This is quite a bit later, but very similar. You've got Jack Drift and Joe. Is that right? Jack Thrift and Joe Drift. Again, there was lots of morality tales in the advertising that makes it quite fascinating as well. But both the TSB and Halifax adverts were so bright and colourful, and also, largely speaking, very few words on them as well. And the one on the right-hand side, you can see, is actually aimed at children, so they could go away and make a sort of little model house. Last example is I've contrasted it with one of the Lloyds adverts, which I think is quite very serious, quite a lot of words in black and white. And then these are actually both from the early 1950s. And the TSB one is incredibly colourful, very bright and cheerful, and again, very few words, because of course the advertising was aimed at completely different demographics. Well, that's sort of basically a charge through the archives of both Halifax and TSB. So the Halifax has demutualised. It's no longer a building society, demutualised before it was taken over, or before it became part of Halifax Bank of Scotland. The TSB has been divested, but I would argue that the legacy of both can be seen in the group's Helping Britain Prosper plan, through examples of Halifax focusing on trying to help first-time buyers, and also the group's charitable foundations. There are 4 Lloyds Bank charitable foundations, and these were actually set up originally in 1986 when the TSB floated on the stock exchange, when it sort of moved away from its philanthropic roots, really, floated on the stock exchange, and that was one of the conditions of the flotation, that these charitable institutions were set up as a recognition of its philanthropic roots. And there's just one last thing I'd just like to end with is another cautionary tale, another bit of advertising from TSB in the 1930s, and again ties in nicely with the poetry we've just had. With the poetry from Nationwide. So it goes, Mary had a lot of cash, she spent it every day on ices, sweets and lollipops in quite a reckless way. Susie hadn't very much, but she made it a rule to take a little every week and bank it at her school. Now Susie has a camera, a bicycle and pen, and even manages to go to Blackpool now and then. Poor Mary suffers much from spots. She's very far from healthy. I fear unless she mends her ways, she never will be wealthy. Thank you.